Hello everybody, today I wanted to take the opportunity to talk about the Resident Evil Remake and why it's my favorite horror game of all time, my favorite game in the Resident Evil series, and in general it's just one of my favorite games across the board. So without more preamble, let's get going. One of the defining characteristics of the classic Resident Evil games is that control's handled via a scheme that's kind of been dubbed tank control, and the general gist of this is just what it sounds like. When playing, your character controls exactly like they would if they were a tank. They turn all the way around almost like they're on treads, and control is slightly sluggish and feels a lot weightier than other third-person games, both at the time of release and since. And most importantly, your character lacks the ability to utilize any sort of precision aiming. On the surface, this may sound like a bad thing. It almost definitely sounds like a bad thing, but let me explain. The feeling of horror, of fear, at its core, comes from the sensation of helplessness. The impression that you're perilously underprepared to handle a situation. The tank controls further that goal in a way that becomes sort of second nature as soon as a player adjusts to these controls. I actually had multiple friends over to play this game in preparation for this video, just to test this theory and see if I was remembering it correctly, and virtually all of them adapted to the tank controls within about 10 minutes of play. Now there's a fine line to be walked between encouraging fear and making bad controls, but the controls of Resident Evil err on the side of good for one very specific reason, and that reason is that they are predictable. When you press a button, you know exactly what will happen and when, and the panic comes in not knowing if you're going to be able to move fast enough. Do you stay in place and hope the next shot is the one that finishes the job, or do you start the slow turning animation in order to try and make some space for yourself? A clear example of just how important this control scheme actually is would be going on your own and trying the alternate control scheme included in the PC re-release of the game. This alternate control scheme has two main problems. For one, it trivializes combat against most of the game's enemies, standard zombies and bosses especially. Standard zombies and bosses make up both the meat and potatoes of this game, so to speak, so to see the balance so radically thrown out of whack by such a seemingly minute change shows in no uncertain terms, at least in my mind, how important these controls actually are. But that's not even the worst of it. The most sizable failure of this more traditional control scheme, or more modern control scheme, is that it hampers the fluidity of movement and motion. In a game like Resident Evil that's viewed from defined camera angles, having a directed sense of position and movement is incredibly important for maintaining momentum. The tank controls accomplish this by having you maintain your direction when you transition between cameras. This immediately communicates intuitively that your controls are now relative to this new angle. You see your character as an extension of the D-pad, and you have a distinct hold on what each button press and the amount of time pressing that button will do. When using the alternate control scheme, this maintaining of direction is still in place, but the character now has 360 degrees of possible immediate movement directions, where before, they really only had two, forward and backward. And so the stick reorients to the new angle as soon as you let go of whatever direction you were previously holding when you transition between camera angles. And this causes some unfortunate consequences, as the calculation of a different trajectory sends you clumsily shooting off in some unintended direction, all because you didn't stop and take the time to reorient to each and every new camera angle. The game has hundreds of different angles, so to say this change destroys the momentum of movement really is not an exaggeration. Between these two major issues, I think it's pretty plain to see that not only are tank controls not a design flaw, but they're an integral part of the experience from front to back. This is just the first example of an important piece of design that does more than one thing, as it also allows for the game's pre-rendered visuals and the camera angles that I mentioned earlier. And speaking of those, the visuals of the Resident Evil series have always been pretty strong, even back in the days of the original Resident Evil, when the characters still looked like they were constructed exclusively of Doritos. The reason for this is almost entirely because of the series' use of pre-rendered backgrounds, and the way this works is pretty simple. A more powerful computer is used to model out and render the areas in the game, then that rendering is processed into what is essentially an animated texture. That means that when used properly, some pretty stunning visuals can be created, and this is a pretty stellar example of that. The game was initially released back in 2002, and the fact that it still stands up after only very minor tweaking is a testament to the power of this technique, when it's actually leveraged correctly. There's a trade-off, of course, in that there's limited interactivity with these backgrounds that make up most of the game's environments, and this trade-off makes this technique an unattractive option for more open-ended and open-world games. But in the case of this game in particular, it's a trade that's well worth making, especially considering horror games are probably the genre that benefits the most from increased visual fidelity. Imagine PT with previous gen graphics, for instance. But speaking of horror, Man, atmosphere is such a nebulous and difficult thing to explain. It's a conglomeration of all the different aspects of a game, coming together to further the depth of a specific tone. The Resident Evil series has traditionally had this down pat, but Remake raises the bar to such a degree that the game's atmosphere is almost a palpable character in and of itself. The visuals and audio have a sort of synergy in this game. It knows exactly what music needs to go where, and if you pay close attention, you'll notice that the intense music, the music based more in the foreground, is placed with less intense music, or even silence, around it, to give the tension the room to breathe that's needed for the game's atmosphere not to lose its impact after the first couple hours. The atmosphere is made up of more than just the music, though. It's more even than the visuals. It's all of these superficial and subliminal elements, combined with the more concrete and quantifiable gameplay elements, chief among them being the survival part of the survival horror. Now, for anybody not familiar, Resident Evil is considered to be the game to really create the survival horror subgenre. Now, before you take to the comments to point out the few games with similar elements that predate this, I will just say, I know. But anyways, when you break down survival horror, you get survival and horror. But while the horror aspect of this game is exceedingly obvious, the survival aspect is not quite so upfront. Survival in game terms comes from the need to manage resources of some kind to succeed, and resources are something that Resident Evil has in abundance, both in the original and the remake. Some of these resources you may not even have noticed. There are the game saves, ammo, healing items, that's all pretty plain enough to see. There's also something else though. There are choices, decisions that differentiate your playthrough from someone else's. There's the choice about whether or not you're going to use ammo to kill a zombie. There's the choice after you kill a zombie, whether you're going to burn it or avoid the room when it comes back stronger, or if you're going to kill it now and take care of it later. All of these choices, and way more choices that I can't even begin to scratch the surface on, impact the flow of the game to a significant degree. There were entire hallways, areas, rooms I had to avoid in virtually every playthrough I've done, because I left so many powered up zombies in there that there was virtually no way I was getting through there without serious risk or guaranteed failure. These choices are something that I love personally because they add replay value while also supporting the game's atmosphere. This keeps you engaged even when you're just moving from room to room, because you're having to prepare for these choices and for the unforeseen, on your first playthrough especially. And that engagement adds tension, and that tension is what props up the visuals, sound, and more base gameplay. That's what makes up the atmosphere of this game, and that atmosphere really drives your play experience. Like I said, it's like a character in and of itself. It's almost the most expressive character in the game if I really think about it actually. But sometimes you just need to slow that whole experience down a little. The original Resident Evil was famous, or infamous I suppose, for its puzzles. Now whatever you think of these puzzles, I can assure you they serve a purpose, multiple purposes even. These puzzles gate off parts of the game you're not yet meant to access. In a more linear horror game, it might just be a straight shot to whatever objective. But as Resident Evil gives you an open floor plan, there needed to be a more creative solution put in place to keep the player on track and progressing in the intended order. That solution takes the form of this game's puzzles. While most of these puzzles are pretty shallow, they're usually about a 5-minute proposition at most. They serve not only to keep you corralled where you're supposed to be, but also to give the player a pace break to relieve some of that tension and keep them playing. Without these more relaxed moments, the game has a real possibility of overwhelming the player, or at the very least keeping them from enjoying themselves. Now given that realization, I always kind of love the puzzles in Resident Evil. They're easy enough never to slow you down too much, but just hard enough to give you some sense of satisfaction in completing them. Just for fun, I tested this for this video and had my friends Alex and Jay play this game for the first time. It was immediately apparent that even though they were more scared of the game than I was, being that I already knew where every scare was, they still were able to maintain longer play sessions than I was able to on average. As a player who knows all the game's puzzles by memory, I'm able to see exactly what the game plays like without the pace breaks the puzzles usually afford. And I have to say the result is pretty grueling. My play sessions of this game for this video were probably an hour at most before I had to take a break, where my friends were able to play 2 or 3 hours in a single sitting with virtually no burnout, even though they're both complete pansies about horror games and spent the entirety of that few hours looking like they were going to brick on my chair.
X. Oh, that didn't kill him. Okay.
Oh, you're gonna need a lot more than one bullet.
What?
This affords us the ability to see just how incredibly important these pace breaks are in making the experience gratifying and keeping it gratifying. But speaking of slowing things down, I guess I should probably wrap this up. At the end of the day, the Resident Evil Remake is my favorite game in the series. It's one of my favorite games of all time, actually. And if you have an interest in horror games, I recommend you give it a shot, even if you haven't already. It's worth playing, even if you just want to take a look at all the design decisions this game makes. It's a masterclass in spacing, atmosphere, tension, and polish. And unfortunately, it's been more or less forgotten. It can be a little difficult initially getting adjusted to the control scheme, but I assure you it becomes second nature within like 10 to 20 minutes usually. And if you have a PC or even an old GameCube you can play it on, I really urge you to give it a shot. You may be surprised at just how scary a 15-year-old game can be. And with that, I really just want to say thank you so much for watching. I know it's been a while since my last video. It's probably been, 4 months or something like that. And this one's been germinating for me for quite a while. I've come into a lot of, we'll just say, real-life issues that needed attention. And I've also had a lot of monetary troubles that's sort of preventing me from covering newer games. I have recently played through Resident Evil 7 in the last week. And I was considering doing a video with my thoughts on that, but also wasn't sure about how doing 2 Resident Evil videos in a row would come across, especially considering I already have one that I made about a year ago. So I guess give me some thoughts in the comments if that's something you'd like to see. Beyond that, I'd love to take some suggestions for what games I should be playing next, and I was also considering setting up a Patreon because I've had quite a few people, more than I expected actually, because I didn't think anybody would give a shit enough to hear what I have to say or care enough that they'd offer to do something for me, but I've had a lot of people ask me about setting up a Patreon, if for nothing else than just to cover the cost of the games, because right now I'm still not working, so that's something I plan to do here in the near future if there's still some expressed interest about it. And I have things like my scripts for the videos, scratch audio files, outtakes, and even some little vignettes I was making about what goes into making these videos, and more about who I am as a person, which you probably don't care about, but maybe somebody does, I don't know. But anyways, thank you again for watching, really and truly, from the bottom of my heart, and I'll see you guys on the next one.